Thank you for coming, and I want to especially thank Dr. Dominick DellaSala for being here tonight and for willing to make a long day. He left at, was it 4 o'clock or something like that this morning, and so he's going to be dead tired by the time the day is over. But, but I appreciate his willingness to come here, and I appreciate your attendance. Before I introduce him and we get started, I would be remiss if I didn't say a little bit about the Gallatin Wildlife Association. By the way, my name is Clint Nagel, president of GWA. That's the acronym that we use quite frequently and fluidly. It just kind of flows off your tongue. And so GWA has been in existence since 1976, and here's our mission statement. I'm not going to read all of this, but basically what we do is we advocate for wildlife, and you may ask, well, how do we do that? And basically we believe that wildlife has the right to exist, to move freely about upon the landscape. And we do that based upon science, based upon the law, and based upon morality and the ethics. For a long time, we would just focus on those first two elements, but lately, if you watch the news enough, you realize that morality and ethics should play a vital role in how we conduct ourselves, let alone how we treat our planet. And it is surprising to see how often morality and science actually go together. And sometimes I've been told that we shouldn't bring morality into it, but doggone it, morality is kind of depends, that tells you who we are. And if you don't have morality, it's like, why are we here? So rather than get too philosophical about it, I want you to remember back to where you were 8 years ago. If you're lucky, I'll say it that way, you were with us at GWA as we promoted a forest forum at the Emerson Cultural Center 8 years ago to this very day, September 12th. And this was not planned. You could say it was fate, maybe. But if you remember 8 years ago what that summer was like, it was hot, it was dry, smoke filled the air nearly every day for the month of July into September. And just about every other day, there was some conversation in the news about healthy forest. What is a healthy forest? We got so sick and tired of hearing about that GWA, we had a board meeting and we discussed, let's tackle this head on and discuss what does a healthy forest mean? And so we came up with this poster, and we called it Healthy Forest, Science or Slogan. A lot of people were throwing that about, and we felt like they didn't know what they were talking about. It's still thrown about, maybe not quite as often, but I love this poster for several reasons. Oh, by the way, you can see the presenters down there were George Wertner and Dr. Kathy Whitlock. They were our first speakers on this subject 8 years ago. And I see Kathy's here, so thank you, Kathy, for being a trooper. But I love this poster. Number one, it shows all the things that you would come to expect in a forest. You see big trees, you see water, depicting a watershed, you see wildlife. The one thing you don't see is climate. And obviously you don't see climate, you can't see it, you can observe it over time, you can feel it over time, but you can't see it. But you can kind of tell by this poster, you can kind of imagine what type of climate this is to produce an environment like this. And that's kind of what we're about tonight, is the ecology of the Northern Rocky Mountains. So what's changed in 8 years? I'm not going to go through all of this. Some of this is congressional legislation. Some of it's passed, some of it hasn't. We're probably better off if a lot of it didn't. But this is what has happened in 8 years, not all of it even, but some of what has been thrown about in the congressional legislation over the last 8 years. How about the last 8 months? You can read that. Some of you will recognize these actions. They've been in the news over and over again. Every one of these, from the Fix Our Forests Act down to the Big Beautiful Bill, most of those have pretty much doing the same thing. And that's in the process of depleting our national forest, increasing logging. You can see here by the Big Beautiful Bill, I think I had it up there, the Secretary of Agriculture, Rollins Memorandum of April of this year. They basically want to increase logging by 25% on our national forest. That includes old growth, by the way. Another thing that's just in the news here recently is the bottom bullet point, rescinding the roadless rule. And if you follow the news and know much about the subject, Montana has about 6.4 million acres of inventory roadless areas, second only to Alaska. So what's changed on the Custer-Gallatin in those 8 years? On the left, you can see several forest projects that have happened since 2017. Some of those are ongoing presently. Some of them are going to be happening in the future, unless we can prevent that. Some of those, like the South Plateau Landscape Area Timber Project, is under litigation. GWA is part of that process. And we're looking at the Highlight South Cottonwood, Cook City, and Goose Creek. Those are all things yet to come, but have been proposed and are in the process. The North Hepkin and the North Bridger and the Bozeman Municipal Project are ongoing presently, and I will show you evidence of that. This is what we got. On the left, you see some pictures that were taken on the road to Ferry Lake. And on the right, you'll see pictures that were taken at Moser Ridge. Just about a week ago, thanks to Glenn Monahan and Nancy Schultz, the Moser Ridge, we believe, was cut about 3 years ago, and this is what you see today. This is a Google Earth map, thanks to Phil Knight, showing you what has been wrought over this concern over burning up our forest. Basically, we don't have many trees anymore. That's obviously an exaggeration, but you can see the scheduled clear cutting and removal of trees, the pop mark of the Forest Service actions, and you can also see some of this from the city of Bozeman. This is what we got concerning Kirk Hill and Leverage Canyon. Phil Knight presented these pictures to me, and I'll let you decide if that's worth it. So this brings us to tonight's presentation. Climate change is a huge driver of change, period. Unequivocal. But so are we. With all of our congressional legislation, oversight, executive orders, interference, I'll call it that, the interference by congressional leaders and state and the timber industry in the practices by the Forest Service, and you add climate change to that, that gets us to where we are today. That's what's happened in the last 8 years. And by doing so, we are doing unspeakable harm to our planet. So this brings us to tonight, our Dominick's presentation. So I'm asking Dominick to help us. Help us understand the science, climate science, wildfire science, forest science, and how all these interact, how they will interface and they will affect our biological diversity and our forest integrity. I will let you read all of Dominick's credentials here. To me, he's one of the better people to have to give a talk on this subject. I first kind of, in all my research when I'm doing comments on behalf of GWA, I do a lot of research and come across a lot of science articles. And when it comes to matters of climate change, wildfire science, I've quoted Dominick time and time again. To me, he's one of the best in the field. And I'm so honored to have him here tonight. And I wish there was more people here to actually learn from what he has to say, because we would be better off for it. So Dominick, I will hand it over to you.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm all that stands in the way of happy hour, so. And I've come a long way, not only distance-wise, but time-wise. In fact, the last time I was in Bozeman was during the beginning stages of Y2Y and the beginning stages of NREPA, Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. That's how old I am. And I have nothing but gratitude for the groups that have been working on these issues for as long as I've been speaking. And sometimes that's what is necessary to bring the ball forward on conservation victories. It's not a sprint, it's a relay race. And people like myself that have been at it for a long time, we're on, or at least I am, at the end of my career. And so hopefully what I present today is going to be inspiring to those that are entering their career or have been doing it not quite as long as I have. And I'm so glad to be back here. Every time I come to the Rockies, I'm just so blessed to have a career that has taken me to some of the most incredible places on the planet. Every time I come back here, it's like, oh, why has it been 30 years since the last time I was in Bozeman? I got to get back here. So thank you, GWA, for inviting me today. I hope you find this interesting. I've been doing a lot of work in the U.S. on what we call ecoregion conservation assessments. It's something that I worked on with a team of scientists back in the 1990s when I was at World Wildlife Fund. I'm now at the Conservation Biology Institute. And when I was at WWF, we were doing these ecoregion assessments to figure out where biodiversity was especially concentrated and what to do about it. So I've resurrected that, brought it back, and put a climate layer on it. And so far we've been publishing these ecoregion conservation assessments, ECAs. We did one for the Mogollon Highlands in Arizona 2023, I think we published that paper, and that's been helping the groups there deal with developing robust conservation planning for a changing climate. We published the one for the Southern Rockies that are helping the groups in the Santa Fe region with their issues. That was published in '24. And we just published the Northern Rockies Ecoregion Conservation Assessment this year. And those are all in peer-reviewed journals. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that. I haven't really done much work in the GYE recently, so that's why there's a kind of a blend here with, okay, I know what we've done in the Northern Rockies. Some of it could overlap with the GYE, so that's why there's a blend presentation here. So hopefully it applies to some of the things you're concerned about. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the projects I've been involved in that are of interest. We did this one with Bill Ripple that was published in 2022, which was a rewilding plan for the entire western US. And you can see your region in these slides too. And these are different overlays of some of the conservation priorities we were looking at, like wide-ranging large carnivore species, connectivity, the amount of carbon in the system. How can we connect all of this across the entire West? So sometimes we operate at this scale, the entire West. Sometimes we switch over to Yellowstone to Yukon, and you guys are anchoring the bottom here of that initiative, which has been quite successful since the early 1990s. And it's important to think of your region as more of a biome. And sometimes we will clip out sections like Crown of the Continent. Other times we will focus on just the US portion. I mentioned we published the Northern Rockies Ecoregion Conservation Assessment, which is just to your west, and we use this to help the groups to propose a climate refuge, thinking that there would be a second Biden term that would allow those groups to have the science to go forward with a climate refugia proposal to the administration. And then we also mapped the mature and old growth forest over NREPA when that was a live policy issue, trying to get the Biden folks to protect mature and old growth and filling in the gaps between what they were proposing and what NREPA was proposing. So all of these different conservation strategies are in the mix, as well as what GWA is proposing with their 7 wilderness study areas and the roadless areas that are in your region. All of it is part of that plan to stop the hemorrhaging. And we know now, after doing this, next slide, for many, many years, we need at least 50%, 30 to 50% of these landscapes in strictly protected areas. You guys are around 12% the last time I looked. So there's a big jump. And the roadless rule was really important to closing that gap. And now we're faced with the opposite, with the administration rescinding the roadless rule. So I'm going to try to really zoom in as much as I can on the GYE and the importance of this place, because when I was with WWF and we were assessing the biodiversity of places in North America to see how important certain areas were, you guys were continentally significant, because a lot of that is because the largest remaining intact blocks of habitat, of areas without roads, are in this region. And you know them all, you've been to them, and you've been fighting for these places for years. You've got the charismatic species, you've got the geothermal features, and you've got the anchor to the Y2Y proposal. So it's all important. Whether I'm working here or any place else in the Rockies, these places are irreplaceable. Back in 2012, Reed Noss and I did this paper in conservation biology. We wanted to see all the different proposals at the time that were out there in terms of what different regions were talking about for their protected areas strategy. This is before 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. And so what we concluded was the median was 50% of all these different regions to achieve their conservation goals. You can see I've listed those here, which is representation of different ecological units in protected areas, connectivity, population viability, and then buffers around your protected areas. This conservation biology approach is what got me started as a graduate student in the late 1980s, riding the wave of conservation biology and new science. And fast forward, I don't know, what's it been, 40 years? Oh my God. 40 years, and it's still relevant, right? Now we just have to add a climate layer to it. Everything that you see there that was developed in the 1980s by people like Reed Noss, E.O. Wilson, Michael Soule, is still relevant today, if not even more. Next. And so getting to 50 by 50 means filling in the gaps. And so you need to know where those gaps are, which is why we conduct these assessments to figure out, okay, here's the distribution of the protected areas. Here's the places that are really important in the area. Do they line up? And most times they don't. Some do. And I mentioned we did this in the NREPA analysis for the groups that are working on that proposal and overlapped it with the mature and old growth forest. We were the first team to map mature and old growth forest in the United States, even before the Biden administration did. We already had 3 papers in publication, which just kind of made me laugh when they said, first analysis ever on mature and old growth forest. Really? You guys really are like the 4th one, not the first. But anyway, it was kind of interesting because their analysis showed twice as much mature and old growth forest than we did. And I was like blown away. But they were looking more at pinyon juniper, and we did not include pinyon juniper in our analysis. But they used FIA plots, inventory plots, and we used LIDAR. But it was really cool to see the feds do this. It's too bad they dropped the ball on that proposal. It had a lot of problems, but they were moving in the right direction. So we want to get to these big, hairy goals, right? And we know that it's either 30 by 30, 30% by 2030, or 50% by 2050. In some regions, it's going to take more, like the Amazon, they're talking 80%. If you're talking old growth forest, you need it all, 100% on federal lands. But in general, this is what we're talking about if you're going to have a functional ecoregion during an advancing climate storm. And so all of these factors would add up to getting to that goal. Next. So this is really interesting. I've been working with the Europeans too on their roadless initiatives. And in Europe, they don't have a lot of roadless areas. Instead, they have low road density areas. And those are really important to them. And so we've teamed up. When I was president of the Society for Conservation Biology, the different sections of SCB had a global roadless initiative. We've just teamed up again. We're doing a press release on why we hate the Trump rescissions of the roadless rule. This is international pressure being applied on the administration. They did this really nice cartoon of the importance of roadless areas compared to roads, and you can kind of see it illustrated here very nicely. And they also have this wonderful 2-minute video that I want to show to you. If you can just click on road free, it summarizes why these areas are so important. You think it's going to sound okay? We forgot to test the sound. Where is the sound? Okay, well, you can kind of get a picture of it, even if the sound doesn't come out. But it's a cartoon version of what happens when you build a road. And you've got developers that are interested. They draw a line just like that, and watch what happens. We've all seen this, right? You've seen it in your backyard. You've seen it in the Amazon. We've seen it globally. And as you're watching this, note what happens to the displacement of indigenous populations that have been living in these places for millennia. And so while we were working with the Europeans on this, I had worked with a team of German scientists to do a map of the world's first roadless areas. That was published in Science magazine in 2016. And we estimated that only 400,000 places on the planet are still roadless. That's it. And you think of how big this world is, that's not a very big number. But I mean, this is what happens when you build a single road. It's not just for one purpose. It has all kinds of ancillary effects. This wishbone pattern that we see in the tropics when a single road is built, like a highway extension. Now, don't get me wrong, roads have importance, right? We have to get around, but they also have a huge impact to the ecosystem, from fragmentation all the way to chemical pollution, displacement of native populations, and that kind of effect. 95% of the forest loss occurs within 50 kilometers of a road globally. And that's what this initiative was about, that we teamed up internationally to promote, and why there's an international press release going out, I think next week, from all the different sections of the Society for Conservation Biology, saying the administration is heading in the wrong direction. Next one. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecoregion assessment that I mentioned from the Northern Rockies, which is just to your west. That's a map of the area that we're talking about, which is the western part. Here's Missoula, and these are different land designations on the area of interest. We did not go into Canada because the data sets are different there, and it's harder to do the analysis by stitching together different data sets that don't necessarily match up. But what we did is this kind of assessment. They had a bunch of conservation priorities. We overlaid the protected areas. We discovered the gaps. We included focal species that they were interested in: wolves, bears, wolverine. And then we threw climate projections on top of it. And that's what you see here, are all these climate projections using downscale climate projection information. And the bad news is that the place is really heating up, right? You can kind of go through the summertime temperatures right here, about a 2 degrees centigrade increase during this time frame is projected. But as you go out towards the end of the century, it gets really gnarly. In general, just multiply by 2 to get the Fahrenheit, roughly. The precipitation is a little harder to predict. The models are inconsistent on that. You try to get the best model you can, but basically more rain and less snow, a reduction of the snowpack, which is happening across the Rockies, and more droughts, and that means more fires. And so how do you prepare for this, right? You don't throw more emissions into the atmosphere by logging, and big, beautiful coal is not the way to go with this if you really want to have a functional system. Well, one way to plan for it, and this applies across all regions, whether you're here, whether you're a little further west, or whether I'm talking to folks in the tropics, you want to make sure you've got the principles of conservation biology in place. Large, interconnected, protected areas, roadless areas. Many of the roadless areas have climatic properties, especially the ones that have old-growth forest in them. We know that the temperature inside old-growth forest is cooler. The humidity is higher. The absorption of the soils from moisture and retention is greater than if you're in a clear cut, right? So climate refugia, you don't want to be in there building roads, because you saw what happened in the previous slide with what happens when you build roads. You want to make sure that you maintain focal species viability. In this region, it could be a whole collection of different focal and iconic species, but you want to make sure that they have habitat, they have interconnected landscapes that they can get through without facing mortality sinks. We all know what happens to grizzly bears when they wander into urban areas, for example. You want to maintain your mature and old-growth forest. I won't say too much about the Biden plan. It was kind of a good attempt. There was a couple of us in the very early stages of the Biden administration that pointed them in that direction, but then it kind of got derailed towards the end. And they started talking about logging because of fire concerns. They were going to save the forest by logging them. And it's unfortunate, but they were at least, we got an inventory out of it, and that's a good first step. And then we got to prepare communities for the worst of the climate shift, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next set of slides. So I mentioned the buffer. You've all seen this nasty slide with the boundary between Yellowstone and the logging outside the forest. When you have a situation like this, you get spillover. and you get spillover of edge effects at a big scale. So bison wander out of the park, they don't live very long. Same thing for grizzly bears. And this is just too much of a difference in habitat and security for species. So we need better buffers around these protected areas. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now. I've got not only a scientific perspective on this, but in 2020, I had a surreal experience with fire. We were in the middle, in Southern Oregon where I live, we were in the middle of a heat dome, high winds, cross-continental, which are unusual where I live because of the climate-related shift in the jet stream, ostensibly. We were in a drought situation, and I was writing an opinion piece. I was in front of my computer, and in the middle of that, my power went off. And naturally, I went outside, even though my lines are buried. I went outside and took a look. And there it was, the Alameda fire had knocked on my doorstep and took out half of my town, 3,000 structures in a single day. It was structure to structure. It had nothing to do with the forest. Millions of dollars were being spent in the backcountry logging, and yet my town burned down because it had nothing to do with the trees. It was all structure to structure, and we're seeing this in many places. The LA fires, we did an analysis on that, and the LA fires have been used to justify fix our forests. 1% of the landscape in the LA fires was forested. The rest of it was chaparral, oak woodlands, having nothing to do with forest. Yet it's being used to justify that huge logging plan in the legislation. So we know now that we can generally predict fire seasons by knowing extreme temperatures, the springtime melt of snow, and the vapor pressure deficit, which is the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, drought. When those conditions are operating and you throw in high winds, get out of the way. Because if there's a spark, you're not going to get that fire out. And no amount of logging is going to slow it down. These are fast fires. We have a paper coming out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that says the dead trees that we've been hearing about that need to be taken out to prevent these fires have nothing to do with fast fires because their crowns are already free of foliage. So to get a crown fire, you need crown vegetation. And if your needles are dropped, you don't have a fire problem. And yet, those get blamed all the time, too. And so the amount of logging to actually change fire behavior, even when it's not in extreme weather, let's say it's low to moderate fire behavior, you hear, well, thinning, reduce fire intensity. Yeah, that might be the case, but think about the emissions that you're putting into the atmosphere, which at a large scale are more emissions than the fire event itself that you're trying to prevent. And we've done carbon plots to prove that in different high severity burn areas. Most of the carbon transfers from the live to the dead pools, and it doesn't go into the atmosphere. You see those big plumes of smoke, a lot of that's water vapor. There's black carbon in there, but a lot of it's water vapor. And a lot of the carbon just goes from live to dead pools, and a lot of it remains in the soils. So to change fire behavior in extreme fire weather, even if you could do it, you'd be putting out so much emissions and changing the forest to such an open area. I'm going to show you some slides. It doesn't even look like a forest anymore. Okay, so this is 3 blocks away from where I lived at the time. You can see the kind of devastation. We're seeing this all over the place because we have the expansion of the WUI into the wildlands. No zoning, ex-urban sprawl. And so I wrote an article about this in Biological Conservation in 2022. I used the Sisyphus analysis. So here's the Forest Service pushing this giant boulder up the hill, and climate change is up here as Hades, laughing its head off and saying, you're not getting very far with this boulder. And that's the analogy we use, but we had a lot of data in that paper. It wasn't just you know, this kind of cute analogy about we are becoming the contemporary Sisyphus, thinking we can stop these fires by logging, and it's not going to happen. We might even make it worse. And this is one of the interesting graphs in the paper. What you could do is you could just track the spending of fire suppression over the decades and the acres burning. Both of them are going up. Now, don't get me wrong, we really need firefighters to help our communities. But when you're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, and you're throwing more and more money, you're not treating the root cause, you're treating the effect. And you're gonna have a difficult time pushing that boulder, as we'll find out. This is an interesting graph. It shows that we actually are in a fire deficit compared to historical conditions. And you can go back even further than this, like some of Kathy's work that she's done with backcasting thousands of years ago into different climate regimes. And you can kind of track how fire just kind of follows the vapor pressure deficit or the amount of moisture in the atmosphere. You got dry periods, like the early 1900s Dust Bowl. Look at all that fire activity. Then you got this break mid-century. It was a cooling trend in the Pacific weather systems and a drop in fire activity. This is when a lot of the house building was happening. The Forest Service was becoming militarized and industrialized in fire suppression and beating its chest, saying we can put every fire out the next day. Was it by 2 p.m., whatever it is? The 10 a.m. policy? Whatever that time was. So we were getting really confident, and you had all of this ex-urban sprawl, lack of zoning, lack of planning. Notice what's going on now. It's starting to build, and it even goes higher now because this graph ended in 2017. But this is a climate signal. And this is the perfect storm because we built all these homes in the wrong places with the right intention. Everybody wants to be in the wildlands. Man, it'd be cool to live in the forest. But it's become this real major public safety and fire risk problem, including half my town burning down. The other factor involved in here is the amount of access from roads. And one study showed that, look at how many different human-caused fires. 84% of all wildfires during this period were caused by people. And these different colors show the percentage of fires in different regions that were human-caused. So the higher the population density, the more the road access, the more unwanted human ignitions. But you almost never hear about, hey, maybe we should do something about the roads. 370,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System. Maybe we've got too many. And there are all kinds of impacts. In the Sisyphus article, we looked at impacts before, during, and after wildfires. And I just listed some of them up here. I don't have time to go through all of them, but every time we intervene in a forest system like this, it comes with ecological consequences. It's basically what it says, including bulldozers in wilderness areas. And here's an example of a dozer through a wilderness area in Northern California. It just changes this area forever because it's really hard to get vegetation back on these. They become de facto roads for ORVs. They become places for weeds to run. We call those road runners, and not the funny bird that moves around, but all of these different invasive plants tend to be along the road system. We have chemical retardants impacting the aquatic system, fuel breaks that become roads, all the soil damage. Then it's associated with post-fire logging, cows, ORVs. David Lindemeyer and I coined this the cumulative disturbance burden that ecosystems experience in our 2025 publication, that these systems have a limit. Yeah, they could be resilient, but you can only push them so far before they will flip to a different state, a degraded state. Now, I was in Congress years ago, and I got shouted down about protected areas. Oh, that's the problem. We got too many protected areas. We can't get in there and manage them. They're all going to burn down. We got to get in there and manage them. And I walked away from that hearing, and we published this paper. I forget what journal it was in, but we simply took a look at this. Let's look at fire severity in relation to land use. And what we found was the opposite of what those Congress people were yelling at me about. The areas with the most logging had the highest amount of burn severity. The national parks, the roadless areas had lower burn severities. This is the problem, not that. And yet this is the focus of legislation. I love that slide. That is so cool. I think I'll stop drinking by 2050. You know, we don't have 2050. We got to do it now. We are so close to going over the edge. And this is the perfect alcoholic. I'll stop drinking in 2050, right? I'll stop using fossil fuels in 2050 when I'm dead. And so instead you get losses from carbon logging that are exceeding the losses you would get from wildfires and insects combined. And yet we hear from the administration, we're going to solve the climate crisis by logging. And yet they're treating the atmosphere as a dumping ground for CO2 emissions. And that's just going to feed back on more fires. Now, of course, there are global inputs from fossil fuels, but the logging is contributing to this too. And so is bioenergy production, which is taking the slash and the whole trees in some of the places that I work in. There are 500-year-old cedars that are rotten in the core after they cut them down in British Columbia that are going now into pellet manufacturing. And get this, in the UK they market them as clean renewable energy under the bioenergy provisions that are putting more emissions into the atmosphere than the fires would. I'm seeing this all over the planet. I work in BC, Australia, everywhere I go. It's the same thing, and it's wrong. The science is wrong, and the politics is driving it. I had to say something about beetles, and I'm not talking about the Fab Four here. But I've worked a lot with Diana Six and her groundbreaking work on beetle infestations, which is really quite extraordinary. So once the needles fall off the trees, 1 to 3 years, these places, if they get a fire, it's going to burn along the ground. There's not really anything in here to carry a ground fire. And yet, these places get singled out for salvage logging all the time, and what happens with that is you drop the trees and the logging slash accumulates, and now you got a problem. Because now you got a fast fire, because you put all of that material on the ground at the same time. And so here's some examples of what I've seen as active management for restoration in different places that I've worked in. And you look at this and you have to scratch your head. How is this restoration? This is a weed-infested field in Santa Fe. Here are the logging road damages in the Klamath-Siskiyou region, post-fire logging. This was a more intact forest canopy. It's now a savanna infected by weeds. Some of them are flammable. All of these are done for fuel reduction, and they're having the opposite effect. Now, there are some good fuel reduction projects out there. I don't want to just say they all suck, but a lot of these are marketed this way, and look at all the money that's been thrown at it. And yet, these will make the situation worse. You'll flip the system to a different dynamic. This is a form of degradation, not restoration. Removing large trees and calling that fuel reduction to save this one pine, which is 19 inches compared to the 42-inch tree that they're taking out in diameter, which already is fire resistant. That makes no sense, all right, unless you're just looking at the commercial value. So I get a lot of questions on, what about thinning? Does it work? Well, you know, it depends. Some situations you can lower fire intensity if you do everything right. But that seldom happens. Normally they take out the large trees to pay for the logging operation, and then you've got a whole different situation. You've got to leave the large trees thin from below, vary the spacing, avoid clear-cutting the understory, use prescribed burning, not pile burning, which damages the soils, and keep the other vectors and disturbance factors off of the area so it can recover. Hardly does that ever happen. There might be some good examples out there. I'd love to see them, but, and then you got the road system. So even if you do all of this, and you got like the gold standard thinning project, you're still gonna experience the climate effect of overriding your fuels and scaling up to improve your odds of a fire hitting the place that you have thinned is gonna put more emissions into the atmosphere, contributing to the do loop. More emissions, more fires. This is a nice graphic of how to look at this. The Forest Service has done a lot of treatments, and yet the empirical evidence on this from this paper by Tanya Schoenagel was that only 1% of the fuel treatments actually encounter a wildfire each year. That's a lot of money to be spending and a lot of emissions to be putting in the atmosphere. And again, if you want to increase the odds, then you're going to have more ecological cost, more carbon going into the atmosphere. You're kind of in the Sisyphus mode with this. The one thing I want to say about this slide, and we've seen this now in several of the ecoregion assessments that we're doing. This is the Northern Rockies ecoregion again. What we did is we plotted Forest Service treatments as a distance from different structures. Now remember, the way to prepare for communities for climate change is at the point of ignition of homes. And so we can measure that distance from the nearest structure to Forest Service treatments. And so we can plot those different treatments, chipping, crushing, prescribed fire, thinning, the total treatment footprint in relation to distance from structure. And what we found in 3 ecoregions now is 2/3 to 3/4 of hundreds of agency fuel reduction projects are over 1 kilometer away from any structure. Ain't gonna help, not communities. And they shouldn't call it that, because you really need to be at the structure itself, not 1 kilometer away. And so this is a shot that I think George took this shot, a Paradise, but it could be any Western town, where you've got the structures to structure fire problem in a domino effect, and you still have standing trees. The fuel is a structure. I witnessed that in my town. 3,000 of them. Hardly any trees were involved. It went structure to structure. The winds were blowing embers sideways, 40 to 60 mile an hour winds. We've seen tornado force winds in the California fires. You're not stopping those fires by thinning. Instead, you got to do what Richard Nixon was doing back in the 60s. See, Tricky Dick is on his roof watering his house. There's a fire in the background. He knew how to do it. How come we don't? Instead, you got to do this. This is how you weather the firestorm. Point of structure, defensible space. It's proven science. Jack Cohen, the Forest Service researcher, has an experimental, he did when he was working full-time, laboratory where he sets houses purposely on fire. The ones that have been hardened are the ones that don't burn down, compared to the ones that aren't hardened. Metal roof, screened gutters, vents that are screened, don't use wood siding, keep the structure clear of vegetation, you got the best possible chance of getting through a fire. And that's not what we're seeing in these towns where it goes domino effect, structure to structure, because they're not prepared. All right, I'm gonna kind of flip through this quickly. It's a paper we did in 24 and 25 because we kept hearing what the Forest Service was doing was all restoration. And the agency understands what ecological integrity is, so we put it in their language and we said, okay, we're gonna come up with a way of scoring a system based on whether it's high integrity, which is a reference site like an old growth forest or a roadless area, and what you're doing to that system. Are you keeping it in high integrity or are you moving it here? And so we came up with a series of composite scoring factors at the stand and landscape level that can now be used to evaluate projects, whether they're restoration or degradation. And this is only a portion of the table. There, I think we used 64 criteria, indicators, and verifiers. You can see some of them on here, the structure, the processes in place, the composition of native species, the functionality of the system. You can give them a score and do this nice little spider diagram where you have your reference forest in the highest integrity, and then the different scores depending on how much you've done in treatments in these different places to see how far removed they are from the reference site. And in some cases, you may have to degrade a site, like pull the weeds out, you're gonna disturb the soils, right, to get it to a higher integrity. And you can weigh the factors accordingly. So now we can go back and say, you're not doing restoration here, you're doing degradation. Here are the verifiers and indicators we want you to apply. So we're now actually working with World Wildlife Fund Canada on trying to pilot this on some local application. It's theoretical now, but we want to throw it into some examples on the ground. And here are some examples of how this would apply. This is the watershed we worked in, Southern Rockies, reference site. This site that I mentioned was type converted to a savanna weed-infested field. You go from here over to here. This is not restoration, it's degradation. And we've got the data to show it. Here's a good example of what happened on the Apache Sitgraves forest. This is the area originally, I think it was 10 years ago. Then they did a thin, then a fire came in and they did salvage and thin. And yeah, these are open canopy forests by and large, but this is a huge disturbance burden. To shift it that fast over, you're gonna have major problems with how that system comes back. Okay, so we're not opposed to all active management, but we've got to take a look at how active management is being described and applied on the ground. The agencies, a lot of decision makers and the media often pick sides. They say, oh yeah, the science is settled. I was involved in a point-counterpoint article in the environmental newsletter, Manga Bay. It's a journal or, yeah, newsletter journal kind of thing. And it was me and Paul Hesburgh. And Hesburgh was saying the science is settled. DellaSala is crazy. And he said, no, the science is not settled because we're not looking at the same thing. You're only looking at one dimension of this. Can you lower fire intensity? I'm looking at the costs. And maybe you can lower fire intensity, but in a changing climate, you can't. And even in the places you can lower it, you got to consider the cost. That's not the way ecosystems respond. Why are we looking at it one-dimensionally? And so when you hear the science is settled, it depends on what the science is. You've got to treat the root causes and not just the effects. Root causes right here, right? The cumulative disturbance burden on ecosystems, the high emissions from too much active management. Instead, we should be doing this, surgical treatments, focus on the homes, close and obliterate roads, focus on the already logged landscapes, the plantations. And it can come from folks doing citizen science and activism as a check on hubris. We don't have all the answers. Anybody that says the science is settled is naive. It's never settled, not unless you do physics. And even then, you get into laws, then maybe the science is settled, but even Einstein wasn't right all the time. Okay, so what role can active management play, you might be thinking? Well, again, target the industrial logged areas. Those are the places where we see the most intense burning fires. It's not the protected areas, the roadless areas. It's the heavily logged areas. The road system is a major problem. You got to focus on the root causes of degradation. Some of those root causes are put right back on these forests that have gone through an intense burn. Calling it restoration is really not truthful. We could be reintroducing species that have had problems. The beaver is a keystone riparian species that can slow water down. Water is going to be so crucial in a changing environment. Why not work with nature? Why not work with beavers? Work with fire under safe condition for ecosystem benefits. Do we really need to be putting out every single fire or trying to? Weed removal, removing the aquatic invasive species, We can do suppression in their communities, defensible space, protect the structures, and redirect the spending to home protection, and even remove some dams, like what's happened on the Klamath River in my region. All right, so I'm going to leave you with this. I get really depressed at times, and because I see this everywhere I work around the globe, and I've worked in a lot of places in my 45-year career, and it's really hard to maintain a positive outlook. But while there's not much sand left in the hourglass, it hasn't completely run out, right? There's still a chance. What gives me hope are the young people that are out there doing this. You know, they're out there demonstrating. They're out there, you know, calling for change, because they're the ones that are going to be left with what we've done to the planet. And we need to be working with them. We can learn so much from young people. It's not us teaching them, it's us learning from them and supporting them, because they are the new voices. And if we had sound, I'd run through some of these links, but we're seeing all kinds of cool stuff young people are doing. I've seen these folks working, young kids testifying bravely in court, in front of congressional committees, hostile audiences, saying, wait a minute, this is my life. I have the right to a healthy planet, and you guys are screwing it up. And so I'm so grateful for the generation that's doing this, and especially this person that kind of started it, right? Yeah, and I love her quote about, you know, the emissions by 2050, the guy saying, I'll give up drinking by 2050. Her response was blah, 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 right? No more words, action. I love that slide. Look at the kid holding it, right? This slide motivated this book that I had a hand in, right? You know, science can be the foundation to advocacy. You know, if you hear a scientist say, hey, I'm not going to get involved, I get it. You choose that, that's fine. But the scientists can have such an influential role. Look at Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, Rachel Carson, Jane Goodall, all of these people that have had an influence on our policy. And that's why I was the chief editor on this book, to just show examples of how scientists can be involved, especially young scientists, young professionals, working with the elderly statesmen, so to speak. I so wish I had the volume on this, because I wanted to show you this video. Do you think we could try to see if we can get the volume? You know, I'm also a musician, and I like to look for music as a way to heal, and music and humor. And let's see if we can get the Blue Man. Well, let's try this one first, and then we'll go to the Blue Man. Oh, there you are. That little X there. It's not plugged in. How about if I use my microphone over the... You think that'll work? And if it doesn't work, that's fine. We can just take questions. But it would be so fun to hear what Neil has to say about science and policy, because I get this question a lot about how much should scientists be involved with policy. And if you can't get it, I'll just tell you what he's saying. He says that we have a responsibility as scientists, as people that have this knowledge, to be involved in public policy, to be involved in meeting with decision makers, because, you know, we don't have all the answers, but we've got a lot of data. And a lot of these decisions are being made in the vacuum, in the absence of data and the best available science, whatever that is, right? So I won't pressure you to find it, so it's okay. The Blue Man Group, they did a video on climate change. You got to see it. It's hysterical. And it's just, we got to reach people in a lot of different ways. Music, poetry, spirituality. Science isn't going to do it by itself. Activism, it's going to be a sum of the parts, is the only way we're going to get through this, so that we leave a better planet for the next generation. I'll tell you one last story, then I'll take questions. A couple of years ago, Carole King and I were testifying in the Congress. And just before we went on in the hearing, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "You need to channel your Mr. Rogers." So what the heck is he talking about? Mr. Rogers? What is this, Sesame Street? I'm getting in front of a hostile congressional committee that is going to fire at me. And so I did. I got my testimony. Carole gave her testimony. And one of the persons on the committee, sure enough, started attacking me, calling me a communist because I drive an electric car, right? Okay, my dad fought in the war, but I'm a communist, right? I get it. I was ready to lash out. And then instead, Mr. Rogers clicked. Oh, that's what my friend meant. And so I said to him, I said, "You know, Congressman, Carole and I were in your office yesterday, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to meet with us. I noticed you have pictures of your grandkids hanging on the wall. I felt that because I'm a granddad too. And don't you think we want to leave this planet in a better place for our grandkids than what's happening now?" And he looked at me and he was stunned because he was expecting me to just lash out, right? And I didn't. I reached his heart. And he backed off, winked at me, and that was the end of it. So we got to find ways to reach people, right? Sometimes it's from the heart, sometimes it's from the head, sometimes it's music, sometimes it's protesting, but we've got to do it because we are running out of time. And we're right at the edge of the cliff, but it's not hopeless. And that's my message to everybody that works on this, especially the young folks and the new professionals that are coming in. So I'm sorry we couldn't get the videos, but check out the Blue Men on Climate Change. It's absolutely hysterical. All right, so I'm good for questions. Thank you. Thank you for your help, by the way. She's running upstairs. Turn that thing off so I don't have to wear my sunglasses. All right, please don't be shy. I will break the ice. You're probably never going to see this by any speaker, but I'm going to take my shirt off. Don't worry, there's another shirt underneath. I want to show you what it says. Back off, man, I'm a scientist. I got that from Bill Murray in the Ghostbusters, in case you remember that film. Back off, man, I'm a scientist. All right, so yes, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
The city of Bozeman often justifies wanting to log some areas saying because it would negatively impact our watershed and the quality of our drinking water. How would you address that type of issue coming up?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. We got to get in there, we got to log to protect the watershed. But you know, the major problems of a lot of watersheds is the runoff from roads and the sediment in the road system. Where I live, near Ashland, the road system has so much sediment going into the reservoirs that they have to truck out, I think it's something like a dozen Mack trucks of sediment every year. That has a cost. The road system is impacting the watershed more than any fire would. So what will happen, if you get a fire in the watershed, you're gonna get a pulse disturbance. There's a difference between a pulse and a chronic disturbance. So a pulse disturbance will give you a flush of nutrients out of the system. And for about 1 to 3 years, you're gonna have an impact on the aquatic invertebrates, which in turn have a rippling effect on the fisheries, right? But after that initial damage from the sedimentation from let's say a natural high severity burn, there's a boost in productivity of the aquatic system because all that nutrient is stirring in that system, the fish rebound, the place is just booming with productivity. It's not a disaster, it's a pulse disturbance. The chronic disturbance is the logging and the roads that are constantly delivering sediment to that system so that you never get a break. And unless you have places that are protected that could be strongholds, then you're going to lose that fish population if you do too much logging. Now, that answers the ecological part of it, but in terms of how to manage the municipality for drinking water, Yeah, you could say we got to get in there and thin, but if you're getting one of these extreme climate event fires, it's not going to help. And you're going to wind up putting emissions in the atmosphere, sediment into the streams, and then you're going to have that very low probability that the site that you thinned is actually going to encounter a forest fire. So you've done a lot more damage to the system in terms of chronic impacts, thinking you're going to intersect with a fire when those fuel loads are lowest, because it's a short-term gain in fire intensity reduction. It doesn't last very long, depending on the productivity of the system, 10 to 20 years. The vegetation comes back, and now you got the same problem you were treating before. So you got to go back in, and you got to keep doing it. And you got to keep putting emissions into the atmosphere, more chronic sediment into the streams, more impacts to the system. So it might seem like the right thing to do, and there might be some examples of where you can take a victory lap and say, yeah, we did thinning, and we rolled the dice, and wow, we actually had a fire intersect when the fuel loads were lowest, and we got lower fire intensity. There are examples of that happening, but it's a very low probability and a very high cost. So hopefully that answers it. There's no panacea. Kathy?
A lot of discussions about fire management appeal to the role that Native Americans had as wise stewards of the forest, and if we were to only adopt some of their, their methods, we would have healthy forests again. And how do you respond to that?
Oh, man. That's a tough one because I'm not native, obviously. I'm an Italian kid from Brooklyn. But I have worked with a lot of indigenous people. I have a lot of respect for the cultural values, the use of cultural burning for a lot of purposes, not just fuel reduction. It's a whole cultural experience. It's an interaction with the landscape. It's for medicinal plants. It's for game. There's a lot of reasons for it. It's been in their interaction with the ecosystems for millennia, right? It's really important. Cultural burning is a good thing in the right systems, but I don't think we can ever get to scale on it. The problem is scale. I mean, in some places it might actually do a lot of good in restoration, but if we're trying to solve the fire problem, it's like we're trying to put our finger in a dam that's being ready to break, and the dam is coming from climate change. And while we can have some victories in these, I'm not denying there aren't examples, we're going to get overwhelmed by what's happening atmospherically. And that's the root cause. And you can't stop it if you keep putting emissions into the atmosphere. And even if we had a magic wand that said, hey, I found fusion energy now. We don't need oil, we don't need beautiful coal and beautiful oil and gas anymore because we have cheap energy for everybody. We figured it out. We're still going to have a lag in that atmosphere that is going to go way beyond our generation before things start to calm down, especially in the oceans. We're talking, hundreds of years before this thing really kind of goes back to where it was before the advent of industrial use of fossil fuels. So while we can do some really important things on the ground, if what's driving this is way up here, and it's a global problem, and we're not solving the global problem, it's not going to work at scale. At scale. Yeah, way in the back.
Yeah, one of the things that I would say that's driving this whole thing off the cliff is the breach of carrying capacity by our own species. We're the driving force that's driving this thing over the cliff. There's too many people on the planet, period. Nobody's talking, I haven't hardly heard anybody talking about population and its effects.
Population, resource consumption, technology, right? The population bomb. Every one of those is in play now. Totally agree. It's a major... Yep. I went to a lot of the Ehrlich's lectures, so it got ingrained in my head, right? And it's only gotten worse. And there's going to be an ecological correction and a climate correction. It's just, can we reduce the severity of what that correction is going to be? And unless we treat the root causes, we're not going to have a prayer of reducing the severity of that. And those are root causes. And a lot of it is in the developed countries that have the highest consumption impacts, like the US. We consume, what, 18 of us is equal to like one Eastern Indian person in consumption, or the countries that are in poverty states. And there's a huge inequity across the globe. You've got certain countries like the US and China consuming the majority of the resources, and other countries that are wanting to bring their standard of living up. So now you got this big cultural maze that you're trying to solve. And when you got the President of the United States that's heading in the wrong direction, and you got people saying that humanity's gonna go extinct unless we have more babies, it's like, oh, Elon Musk, right? That's not the way it's playing out. We're still going up and up and up. It might level off, but can this planet really afford 10 billion people in the next couple of decades? When I was born in 1956, haha, that's how old I am, there were about 2 billion people. I think we're about 8.3 now. That's quadruple in my lifetime. And yet, all these natural resources that we depend on are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And that's why I say this, there's a correction coming. And the only way to withstand that correction is we've got to reduce the severity of it. Man, I just bummed myself out. Yeah.
When it comes to forest health, advocates of active management and advocates of rescinding the roadless rule often say it's just common sense. They use that word a lot. And then they say, what we have been doing has created problems. We're outdated, so now we need to do something new. And the new is the fuel reduction, for example, or rescinding the roadless rule. What, in your experience, has been the most effective way or ways of persuading those individuals or those who are sitting on the fence that it is not common sense, that it is something that should be rejected?
Yeah, I really have, the magic answer to that. I wish I did, but I've been working on it for 45 years. And it's the challenge that we face right now across the globe. And by the way, the word common sense, the phrase common sense, that comes from public polling. The environmental community uses it all the time too. Responsible management, common sense, we get it at focus groups, we get it out of polling. That's where that phrase comes from. They're reading the same polls that we are. And that's what the public listens to. Oh yeah, common sense, I get it, I get what they're saying, it sounds logical. A lot of this stuff does sound logical, right? If there's too much forest burning, cut the forest down. Sounds logical, right? And most people don't think beyond, well, wait a second, did we just make it worse? So, you can just try to reach their hearts like I did with that congressman. Have a conversation with them. Even the word climate change is a big no-no in a lot of communities, but you can sit down and talk to them and say, hey, how long have you been here? Well, I've been here 30 or 40 years, I'm 7th generation. I said, well, you've noticed any changes? Have you looked at your snow peaks lately? See anything different? Any idea why that's happening? I don't know. Just have conversations in your churches, in your schools. The key, though, is to try to keep the violence out of it. Oh, man, people get really heated over this. I can tell you the number of times I've had death threats. I've had people follow me. It can get really nasty, and that's really disappointing, because the only way we're going to solve this is we've got to work together. We've got to figure this out. And, I look at my age, I'm 68 now, and I've got grandkids, and it's not about me anymore. It's about them. And so if we could just bring in that next generation and say, we've had it really good on this planet. We've lived at the Goldilocks era. It's not going that way anymore. What about them?
Do you know of any effective school programs, K through 12, that address these issues?
Yeah, I think a number of them that are Montessori programs. My daughter was in a lot of those alternative education programs. I think any program that's going to have critical thinking as a foundation. This is why universities are so important, because you start to get that neocortex moving and not the reptilian brainstem, because you're acting out of fear when you're back here, and you're acting out of love when you're in the neocortex. And that comes through critical thinking, openness, understanding that there are different cultures, there are different choices and lifestyles out there, and just opening your mind. If you open your mind, you get curious, you open your heart. So it's got to be through critical thinking in education and K through 12 system, which, by the way, unfortunately, all the scoring, the grade levels, the scoring factors are down in the country right now, K through 12. And it's because we're not funding education at the level that it needs to be funded. And guess what? If you create a bunch of stupid people, then they're not going to challenge anything. They're going to listen to, oh yeah, that is common sense, instead of, hey, I'm going to do some critical thinking there. I want to know where that comes from. That's what good education programs do. Way in the back.
One of these slides showed that 80-something% of fires are human caused. In your travels around the country, have you seen any examples of the Forest Service getting ambitious about closing roads as the fire danger creeps up?
I wish, right? I'm sure they do it at times when there's red flag warnings up. I can't really speak for the agency, but I think there needs to be more of that. And when you get into a red flag system, when you get into drought, you're going to have to take some heat and close the roads from the public. Otherwise, the risk of human-caused ignitions, that's the only ignition factor we can control, right? We can't control lightning, but we can control a spark from a vehicle or a campfire that escapes. So, yeah, cigarette butt out the window. And that's why I think leaning on the agency more to say, look, in your forest planning, you really need to take a look at your road transportation setup, because it's one of the major ignition factors. Every time I talk to the agency, they are so fuel-centric. They have blinders on. They only see the forest through the fuels. They don't understand that there's also an ignition factor that they can control. And that's, I think they need to hear more about. You got to close roads. You got to obliterate roads. 370,000 miles, that's enough to go around the globe 16 times. Do we really need that many roads? That's just the National Forest System, which is why the roadless rule is so strategically important. And reversing that now makes no sense, because it costs money to build roads. And a lot of these roadless areas are steep terrain where the costs are really high. I'm working with the groups in Alaska about this right now, dealing with the cost of road building, ecologically, financially, and you go in there and you get the trees and you just degraded all the other values. The fishery industry, the recreation industry in Alaska alone is driving the economy there. Why mess with the goose that's laying the eggs, right? Yeah, you just build roads in those places, you're going to impact your salmon strongholds, which is the backbone of the commercial, the recreational fishing in Alaska. That is where most of the jobs are. So we're talking about it in terms of jobs and economics in Alaska, but it can apply anywhere. Did I miss anybody on this? Yeah.
A lot of my comments with foresters, on the issue of climate change, they recognize obviously that it exists, but they say we can't control it, we can't control the cumulative effects. It's a global issue. Our little section on the Custer Gallatin is not going to be effective on a global stage. So they don't take it into consideration. I answer that the best way that I can, but how would you answer that?
Well, I mean, with that attitude, just turn the lights off and go home. I've heard it from the agencies before. They use a boilerplate analysis on their emissions. And this goes back to, believe it or not, the Obama CEQ regulations. We tried to get CEQ to do the right thing at that time by saying, look, you need to establish a baseline that projects involving logging can't exceed a certain percentage of emissions, or choose alternatives that have the lowest emissions footprint. They wouldn't go there. And so instead, you get these boilerplate EISs that say, hey, we're going to cut down these trees, but, you know, our emissions footprint is 0.000000000001% of the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the United States. That's the wrong scale. If we did that, we could just pack it up. There's no solution, because everyone's going to just do what they want, right? You do an emissions life cycle analysis. You trace the emissions coming from the activity in the forest, putting the logs on a logging truck, transporting it, taking it to the mill, then putting it on another truck, shipping it somewhere, putting it somewhere, using the material. That has a carbon cost. We know how to estimate that carbon cost, so do it, and then choose an alternative that has the lowest carbon footprint. We know how to do this scientifically, but when you get an agency that says, hey, it's just, you know, a fraction of the emissions, then you're never going to get to the solution. And the solution is you've got to protect these areas that are still intact. You got to protect the old trees, the large trees, because that's where a lot of the above-ground carbon is. And we know that from a lot of research now. These big trees in a stand of forest might be 1 to 2% of all the trees in that forest, yet they are holding on to 40 to 50% of the above carbon. And those are the ones that get whacked in a fuel reduction. And so that carbon is not going to just stay in the tree as a product. A lot of it's going to be emitted. Most of it will. And a lot of those wood products are not going to last as long as that 300-year-old tree that was chopped down. So that's called carbon life cycle analysis, and there's a method to do that, and the agencies really need to do it. At some point, somebody's got to litigate on that. It's like you're not using the best available science on this, but we need to have an administration, again, that actually believes in climate change. Hopefully that's right around the corner. I am a nonprofit, so I have to be careful. I saw somebody, yeah, there you are.
Dominic, I think we need to call it like it is, in that very little of this thinning or fuel reduction is actually being driven by a need to control fire. It's lust for timber, it's lust for the wood and the trees and the money. And that's what's driving it. And fire is a really convenient thing to use for fear. People are terrified of fire for good reason. You've seen it.
Yeah.
And they use that as fear-mongering to cover up for the fact they're not really trying to control fire because they know they can't, but using that excuse, they can take a lot of big trees.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to ask is, you often hear the idea that the forests are overloaded with fuel from, decades of fire suppression. And do you think there's any validity to that?
A lot of little trees out there, but the big ones are way below historical levels. So leave the big ones alone, right? I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do. I don't think it's going to have an effect because of the scale issue, the low probability of co-occurrence between a thin site and a fire event when the fuels are low. But if they're going to do it, keep it to the small trees, and you're going to have to do something about managing the fuels that all of a sudden are on the ground. And you can't get them all. And if you put them in pile burns, you're going to have major impacts on soil horizons, mycorrhizae, soil desiccation, invasive species. There's a cost. I have 3 articles that are in different stages that are coming out soon. The first that should be out in a couple of weeks is the one, I kind of alluded to it in the beetle slide. Dead trees are not the fast fire problem. And we are publishing that in the National Academy of Sciences with a whole bunch of other scientists around the globe. Examples of fires not burning intensely when there's no canopy, and yet the dead trees are targeted all the time. So that's one myth. The second one is the cost of thinning. All we hear about, benefit, benefit, benefit. What about the cost, right? And if you're doing a spreadsheet and you've got a checking account, you want to know what's in your checking account, balance, what you're taking out, what you're putting in. You don't want to just look at one part of the ledger and say, oh yeah, I just got benefits, and not pay attention to how you're taking it out. You got to look at both sides, right? And when you do that weighting analysis, the costs are really significant to ecosystems and type shifts, to savannas, to actually increasing the understory vegetation, because now you got all this light coming in, and you're releasing all those shrubs, and you've got soil impacts and carbon impacts and sedimentation problems and invasive species. And you never hear the agencies talk about that. They think they could mitigate everything, and that's hubris, because we can't. And we don't have the energy, the time, the money to properly mitigate all these impacts. There are costs involved. It's something like $2,000 to $4,000 an acre to thin a site, depending on a lot of the factors involved and access, et cetera. So there's cost there financially, too, and is it really doing the job? Some places it is, but overall, I argue it's taken us in the opposite direction. The third paper that we're working on, which I think will be out, it's not a science paper, it's an opinion piece, in the Revelator in the next couple of weeks, is the do loop of using the same approach that caused the problem to fix the problem. Right? I hear this all the time, too. I've been in congressional hearings where the timber industry representative next to me is claiming they're not in the business of logging forest anymore. They're in the business of saving the spotted owl from a fire burning down the forest. And I'm there scratching my head, wait a minute, I was on the owl recovery team, and that's not right. But that's the do loop. We caused the problem by logging, and now the solution is logging. We're just gonna package it differently. We're going to say, hey, if we log this forest, we won't get the fires that are pushing the owl out. But we did a study of the northern spotted owl, the only paper that was ever published in 2024. Monica Bond led this. We looked at all of the data on northern spotted owl nest site abandonment. Every single owl territory, and there were like 110 that we had good data on, had logging before and after fire. Most of the territories had multiple logging entries and barred owl invasion. Guess what gets blamed for nest site abandonment? Fire. Not the logging before and after, and not the encroachment that was enabled by the logging of the barred owl. Do loop. We caused the problem, we fixed the problem with the same thing. Now it's different, it's not entirely the same. We're not talking about big clear cuts of the 1960s, but we're talking about taking out big trees, over-ventilating the forest, so you lose that wind buffering effect that you get with intact canopies. In extreme fire weather, it's going to blow through. You might have some victories in low to moderate intensity burning if you're doing sub-canopy thinning and you're removing the fuels that you've caused, but you got a cost, right? And that cost goes up depending on how much you take out and what you take out. That's the conversation you need to have with the agencies. Yeah, benefit, 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 but what about this part of the ledger, and how are you dealing with it? Cumulative effects, cumulative disturbance burden. NEPA allows for cumulative effects. If we still even have NEPA, I don't know. Everything is a categorical exclusion now. Okay, I'm really bumming myself out.
Well, you know, I think, you know, what you're saying makes sense, right?
Common sense, yay!
But
Could use it too.
I'll go back, and you can remember Will Rogers.
Am I that old?
One of his great quotes was, common sense isn't very common. And that's what we're up against.
Yeah.
When you have these interactions, you go, well, you know, you can't get through.
Yeah. You can, and then that's why, you know, my faith is in the organizations working in the trenches. GWA, so some other groups out there. You guys are the heroes. You're the ones that can slow it down. You're the ones that can stop it, working with the scientists, working in the courts, working with the public. I know it's hard. I know it's frustrating. There are more losses than there are victories. But without you guys, it would be a hell of a lot worse. So much worse. The wildlands that we enjoy today are because people like yourselves have been putting in years of dedicated conservation service. So I don't want to bum you all out, and because I get bummed out about it too, which is why I play music. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't give up. There's still hope. And if we don't have hope, nothing changes. So I think I'll leave you with that.